don't do open source if you're trying to get rich. It's not
Right.
do it for the love, do it because you think it's fun, do it because you want to make friends and you want to be part of the community, and maybe you want to maybe it has some downstream benefits to your career, but it's very hard to just as an individual make a project that makes a lot of money, in my experience.
Hey everyone, welcome to the next episode of the Tech Track series. And my guest for today is someone who I've known for a very long time from our time at Stanford together. His name is Feross, and the best way I can describe him is as a Renaissance developer. He has started a company, it got acquired, and he worked at a big tech company for a couple of years. He is very active in open source. He does a lot of indie projects, and he also teaches a class at Stanford about web security and about development. How would you describe yourself?
I sometimes struggle to describe myself. I don't know what part to emphasize. That's the hard part. But I'll say I think I primarily try to think of myself as a mad scientist. Like I really like that the things I'm most proud of are things where I've seen something differently than other people. So I like to look at things out of the box if I can, and kind of do things that people don't think is a good idea, or that people think is possible. So like when it comes to like my career with JavaScript, I've always tried to push the boundaries of what people think you can do with a web browser, or what they think you can do with with some API or with some library. And so I don't know, like my first company, PeerCDN, was an example of that, where we were creating this content delivery network, this CDN, using WebRTC, which means basically like we're creating a swarm of like people's browsers all connected to each other, sharing content, sort of like BitTorrent, in a peer-to-peer way, and like trying to sort of change the way that CDNs work, from this very centralized thing to this very like organic thing where all devices can participate. And it was a little bit ahead of its time, and just the technology with WebRTC really wasn't there, but that's something that I'm pretty proud of. And then after that, my open source time I spent working on WebTorrent, which is kind of similar. It's this project to make BitTorrent work in the web browser, which is an idea that people thought was crazy and impossible when I first proposed it, but it actually works, and it's been used by people ever since I worked on it, and I released it back in 2015 or 2014. So yeah, and then since then, just been doing open source, and I went back to school for my master's degree, and now I'm doing another company that's hopefully going to be pushing some boundaries as well.
Yeah, one thing that I find interesting is that I feel like throughout your career you've had a big involvement in open source, which I think is actually quite rare. For most of my colleagues who are at these big tech companies or even smaller tech companies, they don't actually spend too much time on open source, either contributing or maintaining a project. But that's very obviously something that you spend a lot of your time on with WebTorrent, Standard, and I'm sure there's like dozens of others that you are involved in. What is the motivation there?
Well, so like part of the motivation for getting started in open source was I always looked up to people who could do open source. Like it seemed like when I was in college and I was first like doing, learning how to program and doing stuff with, learning how to program for real, and like doing stuff with third-party libraries. It just seemed like, they came down from heaven. Like these libraries are just given to us and we just use them to do different things. And it seemed like impossible that you could, or it seemed like a thing that you couldn't even consider that you might be able to write one of these things. That's kind of how I felt about it. I was like, who comes up with this stuff? Like, it's just really powerful. It lets me do all these magical things. But like, could you ever even like write this? Like, it would just seem like crazy incantations to be able to like a magician or something has to like go and read some old scrolls and like create these libraries. And so to me, it was this magical thing. And I always thought it would be great to learn how to do that one day. And I didn't really see a path to how to do that because I just wasn't like good enough programmer. And then I don't know, after working on the company for a while and getting acquired and working at Yahoo, which is the company that bought us, I kind of wanted to change and wanted to work on something where I could kind of control the whole design and sort of as a single person kind of craft like my vision and not have to like do it in a way that like satisfies like random business constraints or time constraints from other people, and just sort of own the whole thing myself, like a craftsman. And open source let me do that. And so I just started publishing stuff, and it was mostly garbage at first. And then I kind of went to a few conferences, met some people who actually were good at open source, and just sort of tried to make things that were useful for them and the community.
Yeah, I'm curious how, when you talk about how you met people who are good at open source, how is the process of building a prominent open source project, which actually satisfies a need, how is that different from building a product? You mentioned, I think one obvious thing, like the business constraint, where it's having like some revenue or profit that it can deliver. I guess with open source, you don't need that. But I imagine a lot of the other aspects are the same, where you have to talk to people, figure out what the needs are, and figure out how to construct a solution which actually works for them in an easy way, right? So is that analogy, am I on the right track with kind of developing a product and developing an open source project?
Yeah, and I think it's actually become even more like building a startup or building a product than it used to be, because now open source projects will have like a logo and have like a website, like a marketing page and like examples and like a community. So if you're running an open source project, you're usually wearing many hats, just like a founder would. You're like CEO, you're CTO, you're the head of marketing, you're the like social media manager, right? You're like the community manager. You're like dealing with people who are upset. You're doing customer service. You're like taking in feedback and like processing it. It's actually like extremely good. It can be a really good preparation for running a company, I think. But it is different in some ways too, obviously. Like, some open source projects don't go to all those lengths and produce, all those resources. They'll just be a simple GitHub page with a README file, and that's also fine too. And those can still be extremely valuable. And quality is definitely not correlated with all that other stuff. Honestly, sometimes the best code is like something that somebody wrote once, and it doesn't need to change. It's just basically perfect and basically finished. Certain functions are just like they don't need to be updated once they're implemented. They're sort of timeless, and those things don't need to have flashy websites or marketing or whatever. So
many projects are like that, but I think many more projects are probably not timeless. And there's probably a bunch of people who say, I want to adapt it in a certain way, or I want to add a feature which will fit my need. And I think that's the common thing that happens in open source, right? Where you have like a drive-by developer who's like, oh, I want to use this project, but it doesn't work in a particular way. Let me add a PR and do my one thing that might just only be for me, but doesn't actually have broad applicability to everyone. So what has been your approach to dealing with collaborators, either people who are more committed or people who are like the drive-by committers?
Well, so I got started by just making my own repository on GitHub, and then just writing a bunch of code and then talking about it to anyone who would listen. So, at first there was like no one interested at all. It's just like, no one cared, because that's the default is you just make a thing and no one knows about it. But then after going to a few conferences and talking about it, people wanted to get involved because they thought the vision was cool. And so I think getting involved meant like, building the obviously missing features that the project needed. So I think actually having a project that has a good vision that's promising, but is like missing giant parts of it, that because it's still being built, can actually be a really good way to attract contributors, because they'll come and see like, oh, wow, okay, I like the vision. This is great. Oh, but it's just like missing this thing. And it's super obvious that that's a thing that like the project wants and needs. And so they can like start working on that without almost any coordination, really. And so, yeah, like having like obvious missing things or like easy bugs that people can come in and fix is pretty helpful. And then I think like one thing that I didn't do as good of a job on, but is also super important for getting contributors is, just engaging with people when they actually like come and, work on stuff and send you pull requests, and like being pretty responsive to that. I think I did an okay job. I'm probably being hard on myself, but nothing is as demotivating as like sending a pull request to a project and having it sit there, which there were definitely periods in the last few years where I've just been busy with lots of projects and haven't been able to like get back to people. And that's definitely the way not to do it. But yeah, as a volunteer project, there's really only so much time you have in the day to work on stuff. And so
that was my last question about open source. Unless you have like, some sort of sponsorship page where a lot of open source projects they have that now. But for the most part, it's all volunteer work. So I know I was looking through your blog. I know you have some strong thoughts on this. What do you think about the open source funding model? Because so many people get benefit from open source, but not many contribute back. And like, what are your ideas on how to fix that?
I mean, it's a really hard problem. Basically, open source is, there's different types of open source. That's the other thing too. It's like, we talk about open source like this monolithic thing, but like you kind of almost have to break it down into like what type of like open source you're dealing with. So there's like some open source that is like released by a company for some strategic reason. Like they're, I don't know, it's Google and they're releasing some library and they like want developers to build on it so that like they have like, they can sort of define the paradigm of like how people are going to program, right? That's like a thing where, you know, there's a company that's sponsoring it that has like paid employees that are working on it, and it's open source to varying degrees. You might be able to send some bug fixes. You might be able to like see the code, but maybe you can't send in bug fixes. Maybe you can't actually contribute. You just see the code. There's like, but then there's some that are like sort of fully open source, but like, you know, 99% of the contributions come from employees. So, or, you know, that are employed by some company. And that's like one type. And there's lots of stuff that's like that we use all the time. And then there's like the other big kind, I think, is like projects made by individuals. So individuals just make a thing, solve their own problem, right? And put some code out there, and then it ends up being useful and gets integrated into some other dependencies or into some large company projects. And those projects are they get used by Fortune 500 companies sometimes. And those Fortune 500 companies don't know that like some random person is the one who made the code that they're building their whole business on. And I mean, that's beautiful in some ways. It's really cool. It's like you just released a thing and like it was so good that people used it. On the other hand, it's like it feels kind of weird to know that like, you know, it could be like some person. I have a friend who does a lot of open source, who like lives on a sailboat and you know, is like constantly just traveling the world and goes like months at a time without internet, and like is kind of an anarchist. And like it's crazy to think that like all these companies are building their businesses and like the global economy is running, and it's all powered by like people like that in a lot of cases who just put some good code out there. And you know,
what you're describing here is almost an awareness issue, where it's like, you know, these big companies are using the work of this anarchist friend without even knowing. So do you think that if they knew, they would be happy to contribute you know, a salary or some sort of wage to that person if we were able to solve the awareness problem? Or is it deeper than that?
Well, I think it's deeper than that, because companies can't really spend money on things unless they can justify it. And like donations are just like a hard thing to get a company to do. Usually if they do it, it's like for marketing or PR reasons, but you can't just like go to a company and say, could you please just give me free money? Even if they like know that they're relying on your software and it would benefit them, they're just like not a way in like how do they justify to their boss like why they're just like sending money to this random internet person for no reason, right? so like one thing that open source people should do better is find some way to provide something in return that can be like put onto an invoice that the company can use to justify like, here's what we're buying for this. Companies usually have some amount of money devoted to like sponsoring meetups or doing some marketing and outreach to developers, especially if it's a company that makes like a developer tool or something where they're trying to have like mind share of developers. And then lastly, the other thing I've seen people do is consulting. So that's like, you know, trading your time, you know, trading your hours for dollars. And you can make a name for yourself by like making a really popular project. And then people can come to you and say, you know, hey, we're trying to use it and we had some trouble with it. And, you know, we'd like to hire you to help us use this in our app or, you know, fix these problems we're seeing in production. And that can be pretty lucrative as well. So those are the models. I think there should be a lot more models than this. This is the thing I've been, you know, I spent some time looking into back in like 2017, 2018, when I was doing open source full time. I was trying to find like new ways because I wasn't satisfied with just these choices. In open source, you look at the people who are doing really well, and like the individual, you know, these individuals who are doing really well in open source are just making like, I don't know, a quarter of like, you know, a big tech salary. and that's considered like doing super well in open source. So like, there's these like mega stars in open source, like Sindra Sorhus and Evan Yu, who like last I checked were making like around 10K, or they might be more or less now. I haven't looked recently, but like that's great. I mean, that's a lot of 10K, US dollars is plenty to live on, like probably anywhere. But if that's like the best, that's like the best that we can do in open source for like the mega superstars who have like, hundreds of millions or even billions of downloads of their software. And it just falls off super fast after that. Then I don't think we're doing that well for like helping support people. Cause like, you go down to like the person who's making the 100th most, and it's just like peanuts compared to like just getting a software job. So there's things that are changing this. I mean, GitHub sponsors is making a big difference, I think. And I'm optimistic, but I also I think that don't do open source if you're trying to get rich. It's not right. Do it for the love, do it because you think it's fun, do it because you want to make friends and you want to be part of the community, and maybe you want to maybe it has some downstream benefits to your career, but it's very hard to just as an individual make a project that makes a lot of money, in my experience.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a big disconnect because the value to the world, to the tech world, you could argue is similar magnitudes in open source or like a VC-backed company, but the financial outcome is nowhere close to that. Mm-hmm. So there does seem like a kind of a mismatch there, which is really interesting, and I can see what you're saying. It's a hard problem to solve.
The flip side, by the way, is like one way to look at it is if you think about it in terms of markets, like if you try to charge for your open source, then there's like thousands of like hungry young developers who would love to make a popular project and get their name out there, who will just come in and be like, oh, like I'll make a free version of this like this thing that used to be free that's now paid, right? Or that's no longer open source, that's like has like a trickier license that requires you to pay if you're a company or whatever, and they'll just make like an actually completely open source version, and it's super low cost for someone to come in and do that.
It's a race to the bottom. Everyone's going to end up making something totally free.
It's a race to the bottom. Yeah. So like you get a lot of benefits, and you get certain like intangible benefits by like having popular open source projects in terms of people knowing about you and just being able to like talk at conferences, and like it can help your career and so on and so forth. So there's always people who will be willing to step in and like do that. And even if it takes a ton of time to be a maintainer and there's these other costs, it's still worth it to someone, especially early on in their career. So that makes it hard for other people who would try to come up with a business model to actually succeed, because there's always like these other people coming in. It looks like the fire alarm is going off in here now.
Also, my wife just walked in like a few minutes. I don't know if you saw that. My wife walked in. Yeah. Okay. So all right, we'll figure out how to edit this out or something.
I think this is not real. I mean, this happened before when I was in here.